Hello everyone. If people want to settle down, we'll begin the meeting. Apologies for the late start. I'm sure there's a discussion to be had about technology and art, but that's obviously another meeting to have. It's my great pleasure today to introduce John Molyneux, who's going to be talking about Michelangelo and human liberation. John has written extensively about art for the International Socialism Journal, Socialist Review, and other publications. And so rather than talk very much, I'm going to hand straight over to John.
Thank you very much, Matt. Right, a number of remarkable things about the beginning of this. We had a chair who stepped in at 30 seconds notice, because there doesn't seem to be one. Knew the title of the meeting. Amazing. I read it. The great thing about doing a meeting like this is that even if the talk is rubbish, you still get to see some great art. The bad thing about doing a meeting like this is I've never yet done an art meeting anywhere really, not only even on a Marxism or anywhere else, where something doesn't manage to go wrong with the technology at some point. Time. Yeah, okay. Or maybe I could do without the microphone, because I want to... No, all right, I have to because it's being recorded. Thank you. Right, I've never managed to do well without something going wrong with the technology. The worst experience was actually speaking about Michelangelo some years ago at Marxism with the old slide projector things, which in some ways were more reliable and in some ways worse. And in the middle, right in the middle, the slide projector, you wouldn't think this was possible, erupted. Somebody's nodding their head, they remember it. And the slides all went up and jammed. The other one speaking on Rembrandt in Amsterdam, and I went to press the button on the different kind of slide projector, and all the slides fell on the floor. Hopefully we'll do better than that. Right, to work. I'm talking about Michelangelo today, not just because I think Michelangelo's a great artist. I think he's a wonderful artist, but not just because of that, but because I think that in talking about Michelangelo and trying to understand him, first, it tells us a lot. We learned quite a lot about a crucial episode in the history of the world and the history of Europe and the history of our culture that is often not understood. Secondly, because I think we only understand Michelangelo's art in relation to that history, and in particular in relation to a Marxist understanding of that history. And finally, because I think Michelangelo's work still has something to say to us about the human situation now in the 21st century. So all of those are reasons to me for talking about Michelangelo, in addition to the fact that I think he was a very great artist. But I want to start just with his work. Well, there you are, that's his dates, 500 years ago. That's him. Well, we don't know really if it's a terribly good portrait of him. A portrait of him by Jacopini del Conte. But here comes the main point. I want to just start by saying what an artist he was. And I want to begin with his great statue of Moses. Now, I just hear the important things. First of all, can everyone see the screen? We've done our best. I think if we could lower lights, it would help. Can we do that? Great. More. I think if the lights, the image will show up better. It is the case that Sigmund Freud wrote a 20-page essay about this sculpture, and interpreting it. I'm not going to bother with any of that right now. I just want to say, when you think about it, here is this in Rome, in San Pietro del Vincolo, carved of a single block of marble. What an extraordinary achievement to make something like that, if you think about it. Close up. I mean, I'm always struck by the coincidental resemblance of Moses to Charlton Heston. but actually not an accident. Because, of course, Cecil B. DeMille cast Charlton Heston as Moses because he resembled Michelangelo's statues. Not a coincidence. In the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, there's a wonderful representation of Cleopatra that looks a dead ringer for Elizabeth Taylor. But again, look, I mean, just awesome achievement to be able to carve in stone like that. It's a bit of a sort of a strong statement, but my guess is that Michelangelo was the best carver of stone who's ever lived. Certainly the best in the European tradition. There's a lot of great stone carving elsewhere in the world, and perhaps you can't make comparisons, but it absolutely extraordinary. So I just want to start with saying, look at the work. Can you imagine, the ability to carve veins in the back of a hand like that? Extraordinary. But that's only the beginning. I want to show you something else as well. Can you sculpt in stone the eyes of a drunken man? Answer, this is Bacchus. Answer, yes you can, if you're Michelangelo. For those of you who haven't seen it or are going to see it, you can also carve in clay, making clay and ceramics, the eyes of an evil man. If you want to go check out in Left and Vision the fantastic statue of Negroponte, the death squad organizer, up in Molyneux, where the same is done by May Ayres, a wonderful sculptor of today. Okay. I'm going to talk overwhelmingly about Michelangelo's sculpting and a bit about his painting, but we have to remember that, when people talk about Renaissance man or whatever, Da Vinci and Michelangelo were it, and amongst his minor achievements was also designing the dome of St. Peter's. At the age of 74, but we'll let that pass. He was also a great architect. Also builder of military fortifications, so I'll come back to that. And he created, of course, 2 or 3 of the most iconic images in our culture, the famous David, which I shall be returning to on several occasions. I think again, it's worth noting, but this is familiar to us now. I want you to think back to 1504, when it was first seen, to realize that at the time, this was something dramatically new, dramatically different from anything that had been done before. The theme of sculpting David, right, other people had done this in Renaissance Italy, but look at the difference. I show this image because you've got the people here, you get a sense of the scale. This is where it is in the Accademia in Florence. It's a terrific piece. Donatello is a great sculptor. But in 1440, Donatello, David, how did we got this? 1.5 meters high, as compared to the other thing, 6 meters high, and a completely different kind of image. Or this, by Verrocchio. So that you get an idea of how mind-blowing Michelangelo's David would have been, again, carved in single stone. Now, what was all this about? How did it come about that such a great artist appeared at this time? What do we make of it? How do we understand it? Well, the time of the Renaissance, they had an explanation. That explanation was written by this man, Giorgio Vasari, in the sort of founding document of European art history, his Lives of the Artists. He wrote at the time, and you can read it here. Essentially, the explanation was that Michelangelo was sent by God to show how sculpture and all the other forms of art should be done. Right, the great ruler of heaven looked down and seeing these vain and fruitless efforts and so on that everybody else had gone, resolved to send to earth a genius, universal in each art, to show single-handed the perfection of line and shadow and how to do it all and so on. And Michelangelo was known at the time as the divine Michelangelo. That was the explanation. He could do this because he was sent by God. He was semi-God himself. And it's important in European history, the idea of a genius and so on. Michelangelo was probably the first artist who was really thought of in that way. There's a whole story there. It's interesting that if you move on 400 years to Ernst Gombrich, who in the 1950s and early 60s was probably considered the leading expert on art in British culture, and the author of The Story of Art, probably to this day the best-selling history of art. I don't know how many of you have ever seen it, but loads and loads of people have that to get the sort of potted version of art history. And you look at what he has to say on the subject. Well, it's not quite the same language, but it's essentially the same. He just throws up his hands. The beginning of the 16th century, the Cinquecento, is the most famous period of Italian art, one of the greatest periods of all time. This was the time of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, of Raphael and Titian, of Correggio and Giorgione, of Dürer and Holbein in the north, and of many other famous masters. One may well ask why it was that all these great masters were born in the same period, but such questions are more easily asked than answered. One cannot explain the existence of genius, it is better to enjoy it. Well, one of the things I want to show, some of the things is that with the aid of a bit of Marxism, we can do better than that as an explanation. Right. When I first learned art history, the essence of what occurred in the development of the Renaissance was described as the achievement of realism, of the realistic representation of nature. And indeed, the section in Gombrich's Story of Art book that deals with this is called The Conquest of Reality. What I learned was that between about 1300 and the time of Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and the other great artists of that time, they developed the ability to produce an accurate, realistic or naturalistic representation of the world. Later, I came to reflect on this and realised that this was complete nonsense. It entered deep, however, into our culture so that it achieved great authority and people expected art to be offering a naturalistic representation of the world, and if it wasn't, they said it wasn't art. And by naturalistic representation of the world, they meant the world as represented in Renaissance art and the art that followed in the tradition of it, all the way through to, say, Constable's landscape paintings. And if it didn't look like that, they thought it was problematic, it was something had gone wrong, or it was probably a con trick, or it was outrageous, or what have you. Except I want to show you some things about Michelangelo in terms of realism. So to show this is not the answer. This is the Pieta. All right? The Pieta was a common theme in art at this time, and it depicts Christ down from the cross in the arms of his mother. Now, this is an extraordinary piece of work. You can see it in St. Peter's in Rome, and has all that extraordinary technical skill and so on. Look. But realism, naturalism, but the more you actually think about it, you realise, first of all, this is a representation of an event that never happened. So it's not something that can be represented realistically. Even if you believe it happened, and believe the myth, fair enough, if you want to. But then Mary, even if she was a very young mother, by the time Jesus was crucified, even if he was crucified at a young age, literally 30 or something, could not look like this. Just not possible. They were aware of this objection, they had an answer, but of course she was sinless and virtuous. And if you were sinless and virtuous, then you kept your good looks. Nice story. But then look at this. This, and I was lucky enough to see this just recently, this is the same theme, the Pieta, Christ down from the cross. This is in the museum connected to the Duomo in Florence, right? And this is done by Michelangelo in his old age. Not the very oldest, but in his old age. All right. Now, this, I think, is clearly less technically realistic, naturalistic in its representation and so on, much more rough-hewn than the younger one. This was done when he was young. But is it a better work of art? Well, I think it's a much greater work of art. I think it's much more powerful, emotional, and so on. You see the real thing, it's really strong. And a much stronger feeling of sadness, a pity of the weight. The father figure, it's not actually Joseph, but it's Michelangelo, actually, if you look at the face. But with his arm around and so on. Very, very powerful piece of work, much greater piece of work, but much less realistic. And also, from a point of view of naturalism and realism, has a major flaw. I invite the audience, someone to put up their hand and tell me what it is. Sorry? What's the matter with the leg? Out of proportion? No. Good try. See, one of you, when you see it, you'll go, wow. No, yes, she is, but they put people in size according to their importance, not their physical size. Nearly.
The right arm is sort of like that.
Well, there's a doctor speaking, medical view, I happen to know. No, it's staring you in the face. Go on. Right on. Well done. An artist's eye. He notices. He's only got one leg. You can look at it for years and not see it. He's only got one leg. But it's a great work of art. I think something went wrong in the carving, you know. But. And we go back to the David. Again. Right. This is a representation of someone who probably didn't exist. And if he did, I have an amazing revelation. Shepherd boys in the 6th century BC didn't look like that. Right, so it's not about just representing reality, it's about something else. What is it about? Well, I could do the same about, God isn't really like that and so on and so on. But anyway, what is it about? Well, one aspect of it which is interesting is the homoerotic aspect of it, which was not written about for centuries. Right? You read any book written until very recently, and this was just skated over. But if you look at the work, it is, I'm afraid, stark, staringly obvious and unavoidable. Right? This is the creation of Adam. Right? The focus of the work is the beautiful male body of Adam. Adam is the star of this picture and of the whole Sistine Chapel ceiling. And to say that Michelangelo was interested in naked male bodies is a major understatement. Right? It is the principal theme in his work. For example, right? The textbooks tell you this is a dying slave. When you look, you see that he is not actually dying at all. But it is plainly a work of homoeroticism. Right? Not really, I think, any doubt about it. Even more so when you look at it from another angle. This is very interesting. It is the Holy Family. But what are these guys doing here? This is from the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and requires no comment whatsoever. Except that there is, in a sense, a serious point in all this. This is rightly, in a sense, a figure, a kind of universal image. We have a universal man, if you like, here. And here I think the gay element, the homoerotic element, is significant and serious because, right, and this is a point that people interested in these things goes all the way to Hegel and philosophy. The oppressed are more universal, more representative of universal humanity than the oppressor. The slave is in this sense superior to the slave master. The slave master is particular, the slave is more universal than the slave master in a society of oppressors and oppressed. In racist America, the black person is more universal than the white. And a homoerotic image of a man manages to be more universal. I think you can even say why, because the homoeroticism rids this image of its kind of macho sexism thing that it might have if it was just a muscle man. And I think that's an important element in it. There's lots more to be said about it, but I will move on. So I'll inevitably end up going on far too long. Right. But if we want to understand the real greatness of Michelangelo in relation to his times, we have to start by understanding those times. Right? And I personally found the text which I read that gave me the best starting point on this was amazingly by Friedrich Engels in the Introduction to the Dialectics of Nature. I remember once saying this at a meeting here when Michael Rosen was talking about Shakespeare. I said, you want to understand that? You read the Introduction to the Dialectics of Nature by Friedrich Engels. And Michael Rosen sort of went, and John told us to read the Dialectics of Nature, like, what's he talking about? What's that got to do with it? But actually it is interesting, because in that unlikely place, Engels starts talking about the Renaissance, and he understands that he's talking about the origins of science, but in this period, but it doesn't matter. He understands that what the Renaissance was about was, if you like, the cultural expression of the beginnings of capitalism in Europe. The rise of capitalism within, originally, the framework of feudalism. Right? And he says, I don't know if people can read the text up here, I'll read that anyway. It was the greatest progressive revolution that mankind has so far experienced. A time which called for giants and produced giants. Giants in power of thought, passion and character, in universality and learning. The men who founded the modern rule of the bourgeoisie had anything but bourgeois limitations. On the contrary, the adventurous character of the time inspired them to a greater or lesser degree. There was hardly any man of importance then living who had not travelled extensively, who did not command 4 or 5 languages, who did not shine in a number of fields. Leonardo da Vinci was not only a great painter, but also a great mathematician, mechanician and engineer, and so on. He goes on, he talks about, he doesn't mention Michelangelo, but what he says about Leonardo, about Dürer and Luther and so on, fits Michelangelo to a T. And crucially, he understands that this business of the beginnings of the rise of capitalism was not something that happened in separate countries. For a long time, you can learn about the rise of capitalism, think that it happened first in Britain, because of some special British genius. Not so. It was happening across Europe. Right? And there were battles. Some places were in the vanguard at one point, other places were in the vanguard at other. Sometimes there were setbacks and defeats. That's very important. It was like, if you read Chris Harman's People's History of the World, you understand this wasn't only Europe, this was the world. There could easily have been capitalism in China, but the movement in that direction was held back by the Chinese state. And so, just like the struggle for socialism is international, you get a breakthrough in Russia, but you get a defeat. You get a near breakthrough in China, but then you get a defeat. You get a step forward in Spain and a defeat, and so on. It's like that. across Europe. And it was starting way back in the 13th and 14th century in Italy. Not a country yet, a series of separate states, a series of small statelets, papal states, principalities, city republics, and it was happening particularly in Venice and Florence. In Venice with trade with the East, in Florence with textile manufacture and so on, and banking. And if you think of who was the famous sponsor of the arts in the Renaissance, the Medici family, they were the bankers of Florence. They were the product of this rise of capitalism in Florence. And like it or not, you look at the history of art, you'll find that great moments in the history of art are associated with thriving developments of capitalism. It's true then in Renaissance Italy, then it was true in Amsterdam, it was true in Paris, it was true in New York, it was true even to some extent in London in the 80s and 90s, and so on. And it is this, Engels, amazingly, who surprised us with the context in which we can understand Michelangelo. Right. So that's I'll just say one or two more things about that before I move on. It's important to understand here, and when we look at all the great art that emerged in that period, and this applies to not just the Italian art, but also to people like Dürer and Holbein and Bruegel, and to literature as well. So, Shakespeare is part of this story. That what it is that a rise of capitalism was experienced by people in the first instance as a liberation, as an expansion of the human personality. Right? We know that capitalism in the end doesn't bring this. But that's how people felt it. They felt they were being liberated from the confines of feudalism. And if you compare, say, in literature, give you an example, Chaucer with Shakespeare. Chaucer is a great poet, but when you get to Shakespeare, there's much more focus on the personality. Chaucer gives you a picture of the society, of the social order, and so on. Great. But when you get to Shakespeare, you get the drama of the individual psychology emerging and so on. And the same thing is happening in art. It's experienced as this liberation. Okay, that's very important understanding. And that's why you get these great, as well as the other things I said, you get these great images of man, if you like. But then there's something else when we look at Michelangelo. When you look at the young Michelangelo, the Pieta, this he was doing in his 20s. And you look at the older Michelangelo, same subject, which he does in his 70s, there's a real difference in mood. This is beautiful, optimistic, maybe even a bit sickly sweet for some people's taste. In this, there is a sadness, a deep sorrow for the experience of life. In this, which is again the Pieta, which he did, he was working on at the time of his death. He was still sculpting in stone until he was nearly 90. I think he was 88, knocking at 89 when he did this, and this was unfinished. This is called the Rondinini Pieta, and it's in Milan. The sadness has become even deeper. If you look at this, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, this was done in the very early period of the 16th century. Right? Then we move to this. This is the Last Judgment, and this is on the wall of the Sistine Chapel. There's, again, a fantastic difference in feeling and mood and vision. This, full of optimism, full of elan, celebrating humanity, the creation of Adam. This, which represents the Last Judgment, full of horror. What's happening here, of course, is that the Christ figure here is raising the virtuous up to heaven and sending the sinful down to hell. But where's the focus of the painting? It's on the sinners.
And it's on the horror of it. Look at a close-up. This is not beauty in the conventional sense. This is an expression of anguish and grief. Right. The question I pose then is, what changes things? What is the difference? What happens between the ceiling and the wall? What happens between there and there? Now, of course, you could answer this all in personal terms. Michelangelo got older. Maybe. But I also think what happened in the society made a difference. And this is very important. What happened between these two works, and how does it affect Michelangelo's work? Right, between the ceiling and the wall, what happens? Right, in 1512, the Republic in Florence was ended. Right, papal troops restored Medici rule. The Medicis were essentially dictators of Florence. The people kept kicking them out in popular rebellions. The Medicis were bankers, but they sided with the aristocracy and they bought themselves into the aristocracy. Catherine de' Medici becomes a key figure in the whole evolution and development of the European royal families and aristocracy. In 1512, the Florentine Republic is crushed, the papal troops restore Medici. In 1527, the forces of the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, defeat Rome and sack the city. Right? Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor from the Habsburgs, they are a leading feudal family. This is a victory for feudalism against the development of capitalism. In 1527, the people of Florence rebel and expel the Medicis for the second time and declare a republic again. Michelangelo accepts commission to design the city's fortifications. In other words, he offered his services to the Florentine Revolution, if you put it in modern terms. But the Pope makes a deal with Charles V, the feudal emperor, and uses the empire's troops to restore the Medicis and inaugurate 200 years of hereditary Medici rule in Florence. The Renaissance at this point more or less comes to an end. Right? The man who gets the kind of credit for it, the family that sometimes get the credit for it, actually crushed the Renaissance. The rise of capitalism is halted in Italy and thrown back. This is why we don't get an Italian nation until the 19th century in Garibaldi. It's held back. It experiences 200 years of reaction as a result of this. Right? Things on the international front don't go well either. Martin Luther launches the Reformation in Wittenberg, essentially a progressive step at that time, but by 1525, the German Peasant War, which is the revolution this unleashes, Luther sides with the aristocracy and crushes the peasant revolt. It's a bit like Stalin in Russia. I'm making crude analogies, but just to explain it. In 1542, the Pope Paul III, revives the Holy Inquisition and launches the Counter-Reformation at the Council of Trent. That's the international counter-revolutionary movement directed against Protestantism, but Protestantism is profoundly linked to the rise of capitalism. This, in a sense, is the international counter-revolution mounting. Right. Also, in terms of the economy at the time, very important, the opening up of the Americas with Christopher Columbus shifts the whole balance of the European economy from the Mediterranean to the western coast. It means that instead of capitalism developing most rapidly in Italy, right, it now starts to develop most rapidly in the Netherlands, in Britain, and so on, in the northwestern part of Europe. So between the ceiling and the wall, we have this moment this moment of a turning point in Italian history. You can go back a little bit further and find another turning point. It's associated with this man, Savonarola. You read the art history books, they tell you Savonarola was a Puritan who hated art and wanted to burn all the art in a bonfire. He's a bad person. That's all they tell you. except you think about it, in European history at this time, the Protestant fanatics, who were they? Thomas Munzer in Germany, who led the Peasants' Revolt. Cromwell, who led the Bourgeois Revolution. The Levellers, the Diggers. These were the radicals of then. The meaning of religion is in its social base, not in what the words people say. Savonarola was rebelling against the Catholic Church because of its corruption, against the selling of indulgences, the same as Luther, and so on. And he represented, at that time, the people of Florence. Okay, drawing to a close. Represented the people of Florence. Of course, he didn't represent them in the ideas of modern democracy or modern Marxism or socialism. Those ideas didn't exist at the time, but that was the social force he represented. And it's very interesting, you find a lot of the artists supported Savonarola. Botticelli, who was not a Puritan artist at all, was a strong supporter of Savonarola. Right. Michelangelo, as it happens, we know, cared a lot about Savonarola. What happened to Savonarola? The Medicis and the popes conspired to... Savonarola became effectively leader of Florence, leader of a popular revolt in Florence and running Florence, but they crushed him. The Medicis, the popes, often the popes were Medicis, and he was burned at the stake in the middle of Florence. This is the Piazza della Signoria, that's the Palazzo Vecchio. If any of you have been to Florence, you will have stood here in this square. The Uffizi Gallery is here. This is the most, and they did all the horrible public execution. They hung him and burned him at the stake and so on in the main square of Florence in 1498. Now, can we say that this influenced Michelangelo? I think we can. All of this influenced him profoundly. Was he interested? Yes, he was. He worked for popes and the Medicis, because that, if he didn't, you couldn't have worked. You have to understand that. There wasn't an art market in the modern sense. You couldn't, just sort of hope to survive that way. If you wanted to carve an 18-foot block of Carrara marble, you had to have some kind of sponsorship. For David, he got it from the Florentine Republic. But nobody else had walls like the Sistine Chapel. He was going to work for the popes and the Medicis when he had to, and he did. But he didn't like them, and we know that. It was always round with them, he was always fighting with them. And we know he had sympathy for Savonarola, and we know he offered his services to the Florentine Republic. So he was a man involved with this. He cared about these struggles. He would care that they were defeated. When the Medici rule was restored in Florence, he never went back there after 1530. And we see it in his art. And above all, I think we see the whole situation in Italy and in Europe expressed in one of his most profound series of work, and that are his Slaves, which he did for a project that was never completed, the tomb of Pope Julius II. But look at them. This is the rebellious slave. This has ended up in the Louvre. I showed you the so-called dying slave. This is the bearded slave. This you can see in the academy or the Accademia in Florence leading up to the David. The giant. The names are attributed afterwards. These were works in progress. And the Atlas slave. Now the story again is these are unfinished. Well, they are. But it seems to be clear that Michelangelo made unfinished work after unfinished work. So he chose to leave them unfinished. And I think it's extremely clear what they express. They express a situation of humanity, mankind as he experienced it, struggling for freedom, but where that struggle has been blocked. Where that struggle leaves the human being, the slave, still trapped in the stone, half free, half still a prisoner. And that seems to me to express profoundly the situation in which Michelangelo lived, the years which he lived through, and how he must have responded to them. That's exactly where humanity was at that time. And it's where, if you think about it, in the bigger scheme of things, humanity still is. And that's why it still speaks to us. We are still human beings struggling for our freedom, but still trapped in the stone of class society. And the task is to complete the process of liberation. And that's why I think Michelangelo still speaks to us so strongly today. And I better stop there. Okay, thank you.
Right, so that was a brilliant talk. I'm going to open it up for questions. I've already got one person who wanted to speak, so sure. If you can come and use the mic, that would be great.
Right, thanks. Always the highlight of Marxism, I think, the first thing I look for, an excellent analysis as ever. I would, however, before everyone gets into the real discussion, like to do a pedantic little quibble, which is the thing about the difference between the ceiling and the wall. The trouble with the wall is a painting of the Last Judgment. And every painting of the Last Judgment, by its necessity, concentrates those who are going to be doomed to hell. Because part of the point of the painting is to frighten people that this is what will happen to you if you do not conform with the church and are on the good side. So the people going up to heaven, they're always a bit boring, aren't they? They're looking pious, and they're looking up in the air, and off they're up to heaven. But you never concentrate on that side. You concentrate on the much more interesting side, both because the torment is there to put you off, but also it gives much more possibility for the artist to evaluate that and elaborate that and show those horrors. And this is true, for almost every painting like this. I mean, it's not just the great painters like Michelangelo. Right across through the Middle Ages, before the Renaissance, right across churches in England and across Europe, there were what called doom paintings. And doom paintings, usually done by the local artist, no one of great importance, would produce exactly this sort of thing. And the very few survived. One of the few survives a place called Wenneston in Norfolk. If you go to the Wenneston Doom, you will see all these people dragged down to the mouth of hell, suffering and screaming and being poked at by demons. And it's great fun. It's nothing like Michelangelo, but it's enormous fun. But that, as with Michelangelo, is the interesting bit of the painting. So I think we just need to be a bit careful of making that judgment entirely based on the historical events of Michelangelo's time, because I think you'll find the same in Norfolk in the middle of the Middle Ages.
Thank you. Yes, over here, followed by you.
Yeah, I was glad that John mentioned Savonarola, because certainly that is a point that we often hear mentioned in the Renaissance. If we have a sort of ignorant view, we think, well, the Renaissance is all about this beautiful art, and then this chap Savonarola, he wanted to destroy it all, the bonfire of the vanities. That was about all the beautiful art that just happened to belong to the rich people and the church in Florence, and he apparently wanted to have that destroyed, so therefore he must be more barbaric even wanting to destroy something as beautiful as the Renaissance. In the same way, the same thing happened to Machiavelli, another man who was a servant of the Florentine Republic, as a politician, as a diplomat, and although he didn't have a particularly progressive position on the city of Pisa, which he wanted to crush, apart from that, he had a lot of quite principled positions that he takes, and he was very much in favour of defending the Republic, and yet, when we think about Machiavelli, and we think about the way that's taught in schools, it's about Machiavellian politicians who are power-hungry, who have no principles, who will do anything to get votes. And it seems like, doesn't it, I think, and this is a question to John, is it because of the revolutionary power and principles behind people like Savonarola and people like Machiavelli that they do tend to get so demonised by the counter-revolution and the counter-reformation that follows?
Hi. Yep. And if anyone does have any questions, you should feel free to come up and ask them.
Well, hereby I have a few questions. I study art history myself, and what I always notice is that the people are somehow lost. The history is lost, the movement in history. And sometimes I have the feeling we have to study empty images that are mainly about, style, precision, etc. So I was wondering, maybe you could tell me why art history is studied that way and how we can do to make it more Marxist and more aimed to movements. And second, I wanted to talk about the Last Judgment a bit, because what I found really fascinating about the painting is that it was actually all the characters were naked, if I remember correctly, and there was a big fuss about it in the church, because of course it is, you can see it in the Vatican, I believe. And they actually covered all the people up with, the little textiles to see to make them not naked anymore. So I was wondering, maybe he wanted to also get them a bit out of the Puritan way by, poking up a bit and painting all these people naked. So maybe we can tell a bit about that.
Okay. Anyone else? Yeah. Then follow by you.
Hi. You spoke about sort of the Renaissance and how it sort of showed the way art was right at the beginning of capitalism, and sort of saw it as this great opportunity and hope and everything. And I was wondering if, when you're coming back, if you can just speak a little bit about how that is reflected now as we start to reach more advanced levels and stages of capitalism, how it looks now, and also looking at postmodernism and how it changed throughout the times. I mean, I know it's a broad question, but I'd like it if you'd speak a bit about that.
Yes, hello. I found your presentation very interesting, but a little vague on certain points. For example, you said that shepherds did not look like that in the 6th century, but the statue presumably represents the artist's model, not a real shepherd of the 6th century. So in that sense, it's true to life. You also said that, talked about homoeroticism and called this the gay thing, referring, I presume, to your understanding of Michelangelo's biography rather than the work itself. And it just seems to me they're two different things. And then finally, at the end, your whole argument seemed to hinge on the fact that you say that Michelangelo chose to leave the work unfinished, but perhaps he didn't. What is your evidence either way, and why is it a psychological explanation that you rely upon? And actually, finally, I don't actually see any difference between Engels' definition of a complete man and Gombrich's definition of a genius, which is not religious. Both of them are talking about singular individuals, or artist leaders, one could call them. So why criticize the concept? So I thank you for it, but was a bit confused on these points.
You might not like me for asking this, but he lived till nearly 90. I think it would be surprising if he didn't have cataracts. And this would mean that he wouldn't be able to finish some of the statues as precisely as he did when he was young. And I was much struck by the Monet exhibition on in London a couple of years ago, and Monet's later paintings. They called them impressionists, but they also said that he was suffering from cataracts and he was nearly blind by the time he did those last paintings. So I just wonder about Michelangelo and cataracts.
Anyone else? No? Oh, one more. There we go.
Hello, just very briefly, also wanted to stick up for Gombrich briefly as well. You kind of laid into him as a bit of a kind of let's have a laugh at Gombrich. He's a bit of an old fuddy-duddy, but it's just Story of Art's a really kind of small work of his. It's really quite easy. Go and read a lot more Gombrich. He's really quite good, and he really does kind of have quite a good line in anti-despotism. His arguments against Riegel and Hegel's ideas of the spirit and that sort of thing. So go read some more Gombrich. He's pretty good.
Anyone else? No? I'm happy to let John talk to us some more, so last call? No? John, you've got a lot of questions to answer, so I'll hand the mic back.
Okay. Where shall I? Maybe I begin at the end. Okay, we disagree about Gombrich. I think that it was that Gombrich's book. He wrote loads of stuff, and he was a great expert and so on. But his book was hugely influential. I think that it sold again and again and again, and it offers an account of art which I think is very much on the conservative side. It is very much a Eurocentric view of the history of art as a whole. I think that's undeniable if you look at the structure of it. It minimises the relationship between art and society, which I think is a major weakness. And there's lots of other things, but that'll do. That's why I would be quite critical of Gombrich. And I think, I'll just say something else, that I think art history changed profoundly after John Berger wrote Ways of Seeing, which in a sense changes the whole terms in which art gets understood, which brings me back to the question about how art history is taught. I can't come back to that. I want to go back to the beginning and about the ceiling and the wall. My argument is not just based on those two pictures. I think it's based on the totality of Michelangelo's art that undergoes this whole shift in mood and sensibility and feeling. Now, so I started, if you remember, by showing you the different pietas, and I think it's true of all his work at this period of time. Now, generally speaking, the way art is understood and the way it gets written about is to always see these things in personal terms. Whether it's the cataracts, which I don't know if he had or didn't have, or whatever it is, but to see it in terms of personal biography, or to see it in terms of anything but what goes on in the world. But then you think about how you are, how we are. Does it not make a difference to us? Imagine you were in Germany in the 1920s, and then you were in Germany in the 1930s. Wouldn't it affect you? Would you go on painting, making the same way? You wouldn't. Artists, Picasso makes this point very strongly, I wish I had the quote, are responding to the world. They're affected by all these things. And I think, but they get written out of the history, so when you hear it, it sounds like it's a weird thing to say. But I think it's important. I want to say one other thing about the question of the devils. And of course, the devils and the people cast down in hell are more interesting. William Blake noticed this in Milton's poem Paradise Lost. He noticed, as he said, that Milton wrote freely when he wrote about the devil, and in chains when he wrote about heaven. And he had an answer. He said, Blake didn't know it, but actually he was of the devil's party. Actually, he was identified with the rebel. Who is Lucifer? Lucifer, the devil, if you read the mythology of Christianity, was the man who rebelled against God, who questioned, etc. And that was the great sin. So Blake's sympathy was with the devil, and so on. So that's another take on that particular point. I was really great to have a contribution from someone else who knew about Savonarola and made the link with Machiavelli. Dead right. And if you want to, Machiavelli, this great hate figure in European history, political theorist, worked for the Florentine Republic, wrote The Prince, and the discourses immediately afterwards, after he was driven into exile at the end of the Florentine Republic. And if you want to understand Machiavelli, you read Gramsci's Modern Prince, where Gramsci explained that Machiavelli was not an advocate of evil and Machiavellianism and so on, but was calling for a leader who would unify Italy, carry through the bourgeois revolution. Of course, nobody called it a bourgeois revolution. The terms didn't exist. They didn't understand that. But a national revolution to establish Italy, which doesn't happen until you get Mazzini and Garibaldi and so on. But that's what Machiavelli was calling for. That's why he was a great political scientist. Why did they demonize them? Of course they demonized them. right? If you look at European history, who's the most evil Machiavellian of the 20th century? Oh, no doubt about it, Lenin. You know, if you go on the bourgeois view, Lenin, a man of no principles whatsoever, an evil swine who would do all. I mean, that's the view, isn't it? That they present. Now, of course, they did the same with Savonarola and with Machiavelli. Of course, they demonized people. There's no doubt that every aristocratic ruler of Europe at the time would have seen Machiavelli as an enemy. The question about why history is always done the way that leaves out the people and the society and the broader social forces and so on. From a bourgeois point of view, of course, they want to say that art is produced by individual great geniuses, right, who are separate and different kinds of people from ordinary people. Right. Ordinary people are not artistic. One or two people, or a few hundred, or a few thousand, are born different, and born with an innate talent, or sent by God, or given talent, which masks the fact that actually, perhaps all human beings have the potential to be artists, but capitalism crushes it in most people and doesn't allow it to develop. So they naturally see it that way, and then teach the history of art in that way as well. As a and Gombrich writes it that way too, I think. As a succession of individuals who just happen to come along. You can't explain why they are, you can't understand them in terms of stuff. They just happen to appear because it's just a mystery and so on. So that is the way they used to teach art history. Since John Berger wrote Ways of Seeing, a lot of that improved, a lot of that is changed. But nonetheless, the whole art world is controlled by the bourgeoisie. In many cases, the high bourgeoisie, and it's extremely elitist profession and institution and so on. And this affects the teaching of art history still. But we struggle to change that. The point about the point about the series of critical points I wanted to respond to. The model, it was a sculpture of the model and not of a 6th century shepherd. In a sense, it's neither. It's not. It took Michelangelo 4 years to carve David. It didn't come out looking like that because he had a model who looked like that. Art doesn't work like that. It's not he's standing there, there's a model standing there for 4 years who happened to look as wonderful as David. It's neither a picture of a 6th century shepherd, BC shepherd boy, of course it's not, but nor a model. It's a work that Michelangelo makes. He chooses to represent David in that way. It was actually a work done to celebrate the victory of the Florentine Republic against the Medicis. They chose David as the subject because David slays Goliath. They had slain the Medici family and driven them out. It was a symbol of freedom and rebellion. That's what it was. And it's chosen to be a representation of that. And again, this that happens again and again in art history. This is eliminated. You're not told that. They just omit it, so people don't know what the significance of the thing was. You can walk around the Louvre and you can see a painting like the Raft of the Medusa. Oh, that's an odd painting. Oh, these were people who were at sea for 140 days on a raft. Oh, yeah. And they don't tell you that Géricault, who painted it as a protest against what happened when they put a ship to sea that was unseaworthy for profit. You know, it was the herald of free enterprise of its day. It was a kind of, these people were sacrificed on the altar of profit painting. Not all paintings like that, but when they are, conventional art history often doesn't tell you this. With the question of Michelangelo's homosexuality, his biography, and his art, I was told I was confusing the biography with the art. I don't think so. The biographical evidence is not the point. The point is the homoeroticism is evident in the art, I think. And my case on that. The unfinished question. You can't prove it. But the fact is that Michelangelo left work after work unfinished. in the technical sense. But when you look at these works like this, the fact is that they are stronger for being unfinished. He's making it. Why does he leave it unfinished? Why does he leave 4 of them unfinished? I'm sure he didn't. He was working for the Pope. I'm sure he didn't tell the Pope, oh, well, I left it unfinished to symbolize. No, he'll have made an excuse to the Pope. But why did he leave it unfinished? He was capable of finishing work. I think he made the decision to do that. That is, he makes that decision, probably not even fully consciously, but because the image has that power when it's like that. And I think this is how artists work. Often they see an image in their head, they make it, it works on many different levels, and sometimes they can't even articulate all. They can't even articulate all of that, and so on. But it works, and they choose it because, as an image, because it works on many different levels, and so on. And my view is that the greatest art, and I do think you can say some art is greater than others, the greatest art is not art that is timeless, but art that responds most profoundly and most deeply to its times. And if an artist responds to the deeper currents of what is going on in their time, then that art survives longer. It's not a question of being a commentary on events. It's not like writing a newspaper. It's understanding profoundly what is happening to social relations. And when you go back to Michelangelo or to Rembrandt or to Goya, or come to the 20th century to Picasso or Francis Bacon or other great artists, that the power of their art comes from being able to represent visually profound things about the social relations in the society in which they live. And because society is always changing, but certain fundamental things continue, right? What was said about society in the Renaissance and about the human condition in the Renaissance still applies in part. If it was all a commentary on local events, specific events of the time, it wouldn't survive. But if it's going to the heart of what's happening to human relations between people, then it does survive and it still speaks to us. It still speaks to us here because what it shows is something that is central to the human condition under capitalism. Capitalism represented a step forward. It was progressive. It was a partial liberation from the bonds of feudalism, serfdom, aristocratic privilege, and so on. But it leaves us still in a class-divided society, still with exploitation, still with alienation, still struggling to be free of the domination by the products of our own labour, domination by an oppressive society. That, I think, is captured wonderfully. Both the hope and the promise and the tragedy of that is captured wonderfully in Michelangelo, because he lived at a turning point of history when all that was going, and he responded to it artistically. Now, when we talk about the difference between, the bourgeois concept of genius and the concept employed by Engels, I think he's employing it in a Marxist way to understand those individuals as a product of and response to the times in which they live, not something separate from that. And that's the sense in which I would want to use it, and that's the sense in which I would argue for Michelangelo as one of the great artists of all time. Thank you.